you had a chance to look at the Zoom tips. I think we're all pros at Zoom now. The big thing is if you become unmuted during the presentation, we'll probably just reach in and mute you. But please, while our speaker is talking, leave your mics off and your videos off, as it can be distracting. And then later when we have questions, you're welcome to open your video and we may ask you to clarify. But we'll kind of keep questions until the end, drop them in the chat, and then we'll go over them and with Jered and give you a chance to clarify if you need to. So before we get going here with our class, we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the original land stewards. This is the Land Steward Program. Wherever we are on native land, as this map shows. Here at the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center, we are on traditional lands of the Tequilma people who were forcibly removed and to whom we owe an unpaid debt of land, culture, and history. You can explore more about learning about native lands wherever you are. I know we have people from all over at this link. And I'll try to drop that into the chat after a bit. So we are going to be recording this presentation tonight, and if you signed up, you'll receive a link to the recording a day or two after the presentation. So this program, as I mentioned, is brought to you by the OSU Land Steward Program. This is part of our community education series. So these are classes that we put together with a team of volunteers. We reach out to the community and ask what people want to learn about, or sometimes if people have things that they would like to teach that are appropriate for our audience. So if you have ideas like that, you're welcome to contact me. I'm pretty easy to find. Rachel Whirling, I'm the coordinator for the program at oregonstate.edu. And we have with us today in the background Marcy Kamenker, who is our Education Committee Chair and really helps keep all the plates spinning to make this happen. If you want to sign up if you're not receiving our emails about upcoming programs, if you search OSU Land Steward Program and go to our homepage, scroll down a little bit to that orange bar and click the join, and you can sign up, and that email will just get you announcements for upcoming classes, tours, and events that we provide for the program. Nothing else really comes over that link, over that email list. At the end of the program, we have a real quick 3-question poll that we'd love for you to participate in to let us know how this is working for you. And that's kind of all of that housekeeping stuff. Our program, as an example of some of the things that are coming up, what we have in the future tonight, of course, is our plant propagation from cuttings, division, and seeds. And then some of our partner programs. November 4th, there's a burn piles class with the Forestry and Natural Resources program. And then on November 8th, we have, so just a week from now, we have propagating native plants from seeds, which sounds similar, but I think is going to be somewhat different. It's going to be about collecting, there will be some about collecting plants, saving them seeds, and propagating your own native plants from, really could be applied to anywhere, but we're focusing on Southwest Oregon here. Then we have more burn piles from Forestry and Natural Resources. And then January 23rd, we have a really interesting panel that's going to be about launching a neighborhood climate club, but can be about kind of organizing community around any sorts of themes. It might be disaster preparedness or other learning communities. These are some folks who put together a learning community around climate club. So those are some of our upcoming things. And with that, I would have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker for tonight on plant propagation from cuttings, division, and seeds. This is Jered, and I'm not going to, he coached me through his last name, but I'm not going to attempt it. But Jered and his wife, Anna, along with their young daughters, are the owners, growers, and land tenders at Goodwin Creek Gardens in Williams, Oregon. They're passionate about applying organic, regenerative farming practices using compost to build soil for healthy herbs and plants. They enjoy sharing their love and knowledge of plants, including how to propagate them, which is what we are going to learn. So I'm going to stop my share, and Jered will share his screen.
Yeah. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us on this Zoom class. I saw a lot of familiar names signing on, which is great, and a lot that I do not know. So thank you all for joining us. If you do know me, then you'll know that I love talking about plants. So thanks again for the OSU Land Stewards Program for putting this on and allowing me to enter through your screen and talk about plants for a little while. I'm going to try to keep it on time, but we've got a lot to talk about. So we'll just dive right in. Let me see about sharing this screen here. I'm a plant guy, not a computer guy. So Rachel has been great at coaching me along this Zoom class. Okay. All right. So today, as we've said, we are going to talk about plant propagation. We're going to talk about how to start your own plants from seeds, divisions, and cuttings. We're going to spend a little bit of time on seeds, not much time on division, and we'll definitely cover a lot on cuttings. I feel like that's what a lot of people are here for. But I think it's important to start seeds when you can. And so we'll definitely cover how to do that. So we're going to dive right in. And so, you know, I asked the question, why would you propagate your own plants? And if you're all here, I assume you already have the answer to that question. For me, I love propagating. It's super exciting to watch seed sprouts or to watch cuttings form roots. You know, it's somewhat mystical even. It also can kind of reconnect us with some of the planet's earliest human civilizations as we move from nomadic hunter-gatherers to planting roots and planting seeds. People have been planting seeds for thousands of years. Another reason is sometimes it could be easier to find seeds for a specific plant than it would be to find the plant, especially if it's unique or exotic. And then, of course, it can save you money in the garden if you're growing your own plants. Seed packets are much cheaper than plants at the nurseries these days. And maybe you have a friend with a plant you want to grow that you can collect some seed or take some cuttings from. And plants make great gifts. So if you can propagate plants, then you could spread them out and hand them out to people who are looking for them. So today, as I mentioned, we're really going to cover 3 forms of propagation: seeds, cuttings, and division. There are other methods out there, such as layering, tissue culture, grafting, and more. But these 3 methods are kind of the easiest to grasp. And with these 3 methods, you'll be able to propagate most plants. So we are going to talk a lot about specifics because that's definitely got to dive into specifics. But just like with most things, plant, garden, or nature related, there are always exceptions. So we're kind of going to generalize, but we will get pretty specific as well. When it comes to growing plants and gardening in general, there is never a one size fits all answer. You know, there's a lot of variables. And so it's kind of up to us as the gardeners and farmers to be very observant and adapt to our environments to be successful with plants, whether it's propagating or growing. And I think looking to nature is a great way to do that. Nature's been growing plants for a long time, so we can really kind of look to nature and get a lot of answers that we're looking for. So I want to start off by saying, and I'll emphasize this and say it a few times, that success in propagation will depend on providing a correct and supportive environment for the seeds, cuttings, and plants. The environment you provide and manage will determine how successful you will be in propagating and growing. We put a lot of thought and time into how to start the seed or how to take the cutting, but really to be successful, it really comes down to keeping them happy once they're sown or the cuttings are stuck, and maintaining that environment to keep them happy until they root or grow. So that's very important. And again, we'll dive into the details on how to keep them happy. But that's really number 1 when it comes to propagation. So today I want to start with seeds. And part of the reason is because seeds is where it all begins. We can't really take a cutting from a plant unless there was a seed involved at some point in history. Plus seeds, as you know, same as propagation, it's so exciting to watch them sprout. It could be easier to find seeds a lot of times and very cost effective. One other reason I really like to start seeds when you can is to increase the genetic diversity of these plants. Plants have DNA just like humans, and the seeds carry some genetic differences to the parent plant that can help these plants adapt to an environment over time. Some seeds will be weaker, but some will be stronger. Plant breeders kind of exploit this when they cross-pollinate or cross-breed to create new fancy hybrids of fruits and flowers. Nature does this too on its own. It's important to know the source of your seed and whether the genus or species will come true to type because of this issue. You know, tomatoes, if you plant 2 tomato varieties right next to each other, they're going to cross-pollinate, and the seed from those plants will not be identical to either parent. So if you are starting seed, it is kind of important to know whether or not it's going to come true to type. Lavender, I know we have a lot of lavender lovers here tonight. That is one particular plant that will not come true to type. So if you're trying to raise lavender and a specific variety, cuttings are best, but seed is great. A lot of really popular varieties of lavender were seedlings, and a lot of them were just chance seedlings that, you know, just kind of happened, and people were observant and noticed it being something different or unique. So when starting seeds, it all starts with quality seed. You definitely want to get quality seed. Try to find locally raised seed because, again, seeds are going to adapt to the region over time. So try to find them, source them as close to your growing conditions as possible. If you could collect your own seed, that's great. You know, the longer you grow that plant out in your environment and in your garden, the better it's going to be adapted to that environment. Now, if you are collecting seeds, again, remember you want to do so from heirloom or landrace varieties because the hybrids, the F1s, F2s, they're not going to come true to type. And starting seeds could be a long time investment. And you don't want to go through all the process of starting the seeds and raising them only to find out that you're not getting what you were really hoping for. So know your source of seeds, whether it's collecting it or purchasing them, and make sure that they're going to come true to type. So once you have your quality seeds, another really main thing that you want to focus on is your growing medium. Now, I use the term medium, not soil, because usually growing medium or propagation medium doesn't really have soil. It's a mixture of different components. Some organic, some not, but you really want to choose the correct medium. Now here at Goodwin Creek Gardens, we grow organically, and by organically, I mean with life. Our soils and composts are teeming with life, lots of beneficial microbes, and that's our goal. But for propagating, that is one area where it pays to kind of be on the sterile side. So when you're choosing a medium, you want to try to find a medium that is sterile, lightweight, and well-drained. Light and well-drained is also very important because the development of the seed embryo is very complex, and it actually requires a large amount of oxygen to unlock those energy reserves in that seed and germinate. So if your soil or medium is heavy or compacted or waterlogged, it's going to prevent that oxygen exchange, and you could actually suffocate your seeds and they won't germinate. Another thing, oops, skipped a slide. Another thing is to kind of keep your mix on the acidic side. One reason for this is it'll help with damping off, which damping off is a very common problem with seedlings, and we'll cover a little bit more about that in a bit. And so one great way is to make your own medium. That's what we do here. It can be really simple. A great seed starting mix can be just 1 part peat moss and 1 part perlite. And a part can be measured in any sort of container. Here we usually use a feed scoop. And so 1 to 1 would just be 1 scoop of peat moss and 1 scoop of perlite. And that's a fantastic mix. It's light, it's loose, it has great drainage, it has some organic matter, and that peat moss is on the acidic side, so that kind of covers that as well. And you can make that for a lot cheaper than you can buy seed starting mix. Now buying it's fine as well. Again, I wouldn't get too into all the fancy wording and things that they try to sell you on. Just go for something basic, sterile, light, and well drained. So after you have your propagation medium mixed up, The next thing is to prepare your container. There's many different things that'll work. You can use nursery pots, cell trays. You could even be creative. I've seen people use egg cartons or old cups, which is fine. You just want to make sure that you clean them well and poke drainage holes. You need that drainage for the water to run off. And so once you have your containers, you want to fill it with your medium. And then one trick that I really like to do that really helps is to water your container with your medium very well before you start to sow your seeds. If your medium slightly on the dry side, it can be very difficult to get that medium to absorb all the moisture that it needs to. And so if you're sowing your seeds and then trying to water them in and get that saturation, you could wash away your seeds or displace them. So I definitely recommend filling your containers with the medium and then watering it very well to the point of runoff. You want to bring your medium to field capacity. And field capacity basically just means where your medium has absorbed as much water as it possibly can. And if you add any more, it's going to run off. Totally fine to have runoff in your initial watering. So if it's draining out the bottom, that's fine. So after the initial water in, kind of let that water drain off and sit, and you could prepare your seeds and prepare your label. Labeling is absolutely critical when it comes to propagation. You want to label everything, the seeds you're starting, the cuttings you're taking. It could be simple, maybe the tomato variety or the lavender variety and the date you started the seed, and stick that in your container and make sure it stays in there. So after your containers are prepared with your medium, you need to possibly treat your seeds accordingly. Not every seed needs a treatment, but a lot of them do. One type of treatment that the seeds could require is a cold treatment. This is called stratification. And for this, we could kind of look to nature, as I mentioned. If you think about nature, there's a lot of plants that will drop their seeds in fall after the plant dies down. They'll drop their seed, and that seed will sit in that wet, cool soil all winter. And then they'll emerge in spring when the sun warms them up and you get that nice bright spring sun. So we can mimic this for the seeds that require it. It is very important to get that stratification. One way that you can kind of tell what seeds need to be stratified is what region they're native to. So again, knowing the plant you're growing, knowing what region it's native to can kind of help you decide whether or not it should be stratified. Another thing is if you're buying good quality seed, it should have that information on the packet. So I definitely encourage you to read your seed packet all the way through. Sometimes the information might be on the inside of the packet, but usually seeds that require stratification will say that on the packet. And it's a step that I definitely would recommend not skipping. So this can be done in the refrigerator. You can sow your seeds and pop them in the fridge. A lot of people will cover them with plastic when they do this. I usually don't, but I do monitor them regularly to make sure that the moisture is correct and that they're not growing mold or anything like that. You can also do this in a cold greenhouse, which is mostly what we do here. Again, kind of trying to mimic the more natural way to do things. And so we'll sow our seed and put it in a cold greenhouse, and we'll do that in fall or winter, and we'll let them sit there for a couple months in the cold, and then maybe move them to the heat mats or a warmer section of the greenhouse where they sprout a lot better. You could even do it outside. Just make sure if you're doing it outside that if it's raining a lot, you don't want all that moisture in your pot all the time. So maybe keep them under cover. We grow a lot of popular plants that I hear people struggle a little bit with starting seeds, and a lot of times we find out that maybe they just didn't stratify. So some very common plants that benefit greatly from stratification would be milkweed, echinacea, monarda, lavender, persimmon, some conifer trees, and many more. And again, when it comes to lavender, if you're starting seed, it may not come true to type. If you start Buena Vista, you may not get the Buena Vista. It could be close, but if you want something, I recommend doing that stratification to really improve germination on those lavender seeds. Another treatment could be scarifying the seed or lightly sanding it or scraping it. A lot of seeds have very tough coatings that kind of need to be broken to have it properly germinate. And one way that nature does this is a lot of these seeds will actually be eaten by animals and pass through the digestive tract, which will help break them down. And then they get deposited in a beautiful little pile of compost. And that really kind of helps loosen them up and will help them germinate. We can mimic that by lightly rubbing them on sandpaper, or if they're big seeds, you can nick it with a knife or something like that. You don't want to scratch it or nick it too hard and get too deep, but breaking that hard coating will really help with germination. Some seeds, even the tough ones, could also benefit from a soak. Soak them in water overnight. And to do this, I recommend putting your seeds in a coffee mug or a mason jar and boiling water, and then removing the water from the stove and letting it cool for a moment, and then pouring that water over the seeds and letting it sit overnight. At which point the next day they'd be ready for sowing into your containers. So if the seeds require treatment, definitely don't skip that step to try to speed things up. Make sure they go through the process and you'll have much better germination. So the next thing would be to plant your seeds. This is the fun part. And you want to make sure that you're planting at the correct depth. One kind of general rule is to plant the seeds equal to 2 to 3 times their width deep. Now I lean towards the shallow side. I think it's better to be a little shallow than too deep. There are issues with planting too deep. Either your seeds may not germinate, or they have a hard time pushing up through the soil. So even if they germinate, they won't make it out. So I err on the side of planting a little too shallow. There are also seeds that require light for germination. And so those seeds must be sown on the surface to allow them to be exposed to light. So again, this information should be on your seed packet. If it's not, use that rule, but err on the side of possibly a little too shallow. You can use a dibble, which is what I have here, or a pencil to poke your holes to the correct depth. Or if it's surface sown seed, you could just sprinkle them on top. I do usually sprinkle a little bit more medium on the seeds, not necessarily to cover them, but to just put some medium around them. And then one big trick that really helps me find good germination is to tamp them in well. You don't want to just sow your seed and keep everything loose. I like to press them in and kind of give them a sense of place. And it really helps, especially with the surface sown seeds, to press them in there. And then so once you get your seeds sown, and especially again, if they're surface sown, if you remember, we already have our containers up to moisture because they were pre-watered, which really helps with this. But you still want to water to get those seeds nice and wet and kind of get them settled in. So if they're surface sown seeds, or even if they're planted deep, I like to use just a squirt bottle to water them on the mist setting. Again, your soil should be up to moisture, so you're not needing to add a lot of water. You just need to add a little bit to settle them in and get those seeds nice and wet. The seeds need to take on a lot of moisture before they'll germinate, so a little extra water won't hurt. I will talk about overwatering a lot, but this is not, it's not for this instance. You could definitely make sure you've got the container well watered to where there's runoff. You can see a little bit of runoff coming out of this one here. Now, after the initial watering, then you definitely want to focus on your watering. And again, this is keeping the conditions right is going to be the most important part of successful germination, whether it's seeds or cuttings. So watering is by far the most important part, more important than, collecting good seed or planting at the right depth. Obviously, those are hugely important. If you have bad seed, they're just not going to grow. But watering and keeping them happy is by far the most important thing. So observation is absolutely critical in making sure we're keeping them at the right moisture. For seeds, you want to keep the medium moist, but not wet. And if you imagine a sponge that's damp, it's not dripping water, and when you squeeze it and wring it out, you may only get a few drops out of it, but it is visibly and feels wet. So that's kind of what you're looking for in the medium for starting seeds. too wet and your seeds can rot out, or as I said, they may not get the oxygen to even sprout, and too dry and they'll just dry out very quick. So it's got to be that happy medium. One way is to check the pots by weight. And again, if you remember back to when we filled these containers and watered them well to field capacity, I recommend checking the weight of that pot right after it was watered, and then checking the weight of a pot that hasn't been watered and noticing the difference. And what you're looking for is kind of an in-between of that with the seeds. Again, you don't want it sopping wet, but you certainly don't want it dry. So I'm constantly picking up my pots and trays and feeling how heavy they are. Another part of observation is checking the top and bottom of the soil. Sometimes the top will dry out, but the bottom will be wet, or vice versa. Sometimes the bottom will dry out, especially if you're using heat mats. So it's important to give it a good visual inspection and feel that weight. And then again, if it does need just a little bit of moisture, spray bottle is a great way to add just a little bit of moisture. Sometimes these delicate seeds, a watering can might just be too much. You could use a garden hose on the mist setting, but really you're just trying to give it a little bit of moisture. And what I like to do is give it a few squirts and then let it sit for a couple minutes, and then check it again and see if you need to add any more moisture. But that's going to be very critical to keep it that nice, spongy wet, but not sopping for sure. Remember that seeds need that oxygen, so do not overwater your seedlings. Now, a few optional things for seed starting would be heat mats. Heat mats are great to provide bottom heat. There's a lot of seeds that will benefit from bottom heat. Your tomatoes, peppers, things like that will germinate a lot faster and more aggressively if you can provide the bottom heat. And there are other seeds that really don't want it. Spinach, cilantro, they prefer more of a cold germination. But if you do use a heat mat, I definitely recommend using one with a thermostat. Again, you want everything to be correct. You don't want your trays to get too hot or too cold. And what the thermostat does is you put a probe right in your medium, and if your soil reaches a certain temperature, it'll turn off. A lot of heat mats don't have thermostats. They're just plug and go. And for those, I really recommend using a soil thermometer. I use them all over the place, even though I have thermostats, and monitor your medium temperature. And if it's getting too hot, remove them from the heat mats or unplug the heat mats. You really want to try to go for consistent temperature, consistent moisture. Consistency is key. Avoid large fluctuations in temperature. And then it really, again, depends on the seed as far as how hot you should put these mats. Most seeds are happy around 70 or 72 degrees. And then, obviously, if you're growing in a greenhouse and the sun comes out in the middle of the day, your medium will heat up beyond that 72 degrees, which is fine, but try to keep it as consistent as possible. Now, humidity domes can be helpful. I really don't use them. We do grow in a greenhouse, so it is a bit humid in there, but we don't do anything to control the humidity in the greenhouse. We deal with what it is. And in fact, a lot of times in winter, it could be quite dry in the greenhouse. But if you are using a humidity dome, you want to vent it regularly. Some of them come with vents built in. And if I'm using these built-in vented ones, I'll leave those vents open. And then you still want to remove it completely a couple times a day and let those cuttings or seedlings breathe. And then once your seeds sprout, especially once they get their first or second true sets of leaves, you want to remove that humidity dome completely. So they can help, especially if you don't have a lot of time to monitor your seeds. But it's up to you whether you want to use those or not. So the next thing is hopefully your seeds have sprouted, which is truly amazing to watch. I love watching these seeds come up. We start a lot of seeds. As you can see here, this is only a fraction of the seeds we start. Again, I try to start as many seeds as I can. If it's an herb that's going to come true to type, I'll start seed just to keep that genetic diversity going. Depending on the seed, it can take days or it can even take weeks or a month for the seed to germinate. So it could be challenging to know if you're keeping your conditions right. Is it too wet? Is it too dry? So one thing I usually recommend, and that we pretty much do always, is start some fast growing seed. We start calendula, orange calendula, every year. It's an herb that we grow and use as a companion plant in our garden. And they're big seeds and they can germinate incredibly fast. We've seen calendula's seeds come up in as little as a couple days. So it's really fun to watch, and they can kind of act as signal or tester seeds. So if you're trying to start an herb that has a really long germination period and you're worried if you're keeping your conditions right, it could be good to start some of those tester seeds. And if they're coming up, then that's kind of a good signal that you are keeping the conditions right. And then you could just be patient on those other seeds. You can see here how some of these pots are full of seedlings and some have none in them. And that's just the plants. Some take much longer to germinate. Another thing is, and this could be a bit hard, but once your seedlings start to come up, you really want to thin them properly. And it can be sad as you have beautiful seedlings come up and you're like, whoa, I've got 30 plants in there, to take scissors and cut them out. But it is important. You don't want your seeds overcrowded. That could lead to issues, stretching, damping off. It could be tough to get them separated. So pick the strongest, most vigorous seedlings that are well spaced and thin the rest. And then, of course, even once they sprout, keeping the correct moisture is critical. Again, the most important part. And even as they sprout, you're looking for that moisture where if it was a sponge and you wring it out, it would give you a few drops, but not be soaking wet. And again, one thing to remember is once your seeds start to sprout and get roots on them, they're going to be drinking more water. So your trays and pots will dry out quicker. So even if you're growing indoors where you can control the environment perfectly, so there's no fluctuations in temperature or humidity, there's still no perfect schedule, because as your seedlings grow, they're going to require water more often. So observation, again, is key and critical. You want to check the tops, check the bottoms, check the weight. And again, especially if you're using heat mats, check the bottom. The top of your soil can look moist, and then when you check the bottom, you'll notice that it's dry. And we want that soil moist on the bottom so those roots have somewhere to grow down into. We don't want them finding a dry patch. So be observant, keep that moisture dialed in, use your soil thermometers, and really focus on the environment. And then once they're going strong, it's time to pot them up. And you can pot them as early as once they start showing their second set of true leaves. Here, we usually leave them a bit longer until their third set of leaves. We're usually not in a hurry. We really try to strive for timing. We grow plants naturally and organically, so we don't provide artificial light or heat besides the heat mats. And so we're really kind of on nature's schedule. And so we start our seeds early enough to give them time to grow the way they want. We're never trying to rush them. So usually about second to third set of true leaves, it's time to pot them up. If you started your seeds in cell trays, it's really nice and easy to remove the plug and pot it up. If you've potted in these 4-inch pots where you can have 20 seeds in one tray, you kind of just tip it out. And again, you trust that you've made your medium light and airy. If you did, it'll all come apart real easy, and you'll be able to tease out those individual seedlings and pot them up. If your soil is very heavy, it's going to be tough to get those seedlings apart. So this is another reason by going with something light and airy and loose. And when you're potting up, at this point, we've been sterile. If you've got your second set of true leaves, you can start introducing a little bit of nutrients, but keep it weak. But when you're making your potting soil or buying your potting soil, it can have a bit of nutrients in it. But remember, these are still very young plants, so you don't want to give it anything too hot or too many nutrients. So keep it pretty basic, and you could feed it later. The other thing would be not going into too large of a container at first. You want to step up your pot, even if it's a plant that you plan on keeping in a pot long term, and you have a beautiful decorative pot you want it to go in. Don't put it right in that big pot. You know, you want to step it up, pot it in a 4-inch and let that root out nicely. And then from there, you can transfer it to your big pot. So what are some common problems with seed germination? Well, one is simply no germination at all, which can be caused by a few things. It could be bad seed, so it can go for quality seed. Incorrect moisture, maybe it was either too wet or too dry. Too wet and you're going to drown your seeds out and they won't be able to breathe, and too dry and they'll dry out. Could be contamination. So again, cleanliness is key. Possibly not treated properly. If it was a seed that wanted to be stratified and that process was skipped, you know, you're going to lose some germination that way. So there's a handful of different reasons why the seeds may not germinate, and it could be tough to nail it down. One thing is, if your seeds aren't coming up and you notice your pot's dry, you could kind of assume that maybe the seedlings dried out in there. Likewise, if you pick it up and there's water dripping out the bottom and it's wet, they probably suffocated. Poor germination is similar. If you sow 30 seeds and only 10 come up, one little signal on how to determine what could go wrong there is if the seedlings come up around the edges of the pot and none in the middle, that's most likely that your medium was too wet, because the edges of your pots and your flats are going to dry out quicker. And so it could be that those seeds were a little bit happier and the ones in the middle just suffocated out. Could also be damping off, which is a horrible problem. So that is where seedlings will tip over. They'll sprout beautifully and then they'll tip over with a weak stem like this here. These beautiful tomato sprouts just tipping over with that weak stem, sometimes turning brown. That is damping off, and it's a common and frustrating issue. It is actually caused by a few different soil pathogens, and because it's a soil pathogen, it can spread. And so if you notice it, you want to act quickly. Damping off really thrives in cold, damp soils. So you definitely don't want to overwater your seedlings. It can really spread that damping off. Prevention is absolutely key. Prevent damping off instead of trying to correct it. A couple ways: we talked about using a slightly acidic medium. Using acidic medium will help prevent damping off, so while keeping your moisture correct. And then sanitation. Make sure everything's clean. Make sure your hands are washed, your containers are clean, your equipment's clean, so you don't introduce this pathogen. And don't overwater. Thin properly. Overcrowded seeds can definitely be an issue. One other quick issue I want to talk about, and this would be mainly for indoor growers, is when you have leggy seedlings or they're really stretched out. Again, you really won't see this too much in the greenhouse unless your seeds are very overcrowded, but that's simply due to the lack of light. So if you are growing indoors with grow lights and you see your seeds stretching out and maybe tipping over, one solution would be to simply move your light closer to the plants. Now, indoor lights, grow lights, they're all different. They have different strengths and different light spectrums, so it's going to vary. Hopefully they came with some instructions on where to place the light, because really when the seeds first sprout, you want it a little higher, but then you want to quickly move that light down to the canopy and as close as you can without scorching those plants. So that's kind of where we're going to wrap up seeds. I know I kind of flew through that. Again, it's really about keeping the medium moisture correct and happy. So monitoring and making small adjustments with a spray bottle. And if seeds are your thing and you want to learn more, I definitely encourage you to check out Susie Savoy's class next week. She's going to go a lot more in depth about collecting, storing, and starting seeds, really focused on native pollinator plants, but that really will apply to many different seeds as well. So if you're looking for more on that, definitely email me or check out that class next week. So from seeds, I want to go into division, and we're really not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I definitely want to cover it because it's a great way to make a handful of plants really quickly. And so what is division and how do you divide a plant? This picture here shows a few plants that could be divided: ornamental grasses, rudbeckia, catnip. So simply put, dividing or division is dividing one plant into multiple plants. It's easy and effective. You get very fast growth. And it could also help rejuvenate some plants and help them grow more vigorously. So division's a great way to spread a few plants around the garden, give some friends. So if you have an old oregano or lemon balm or thyme that's not performing well and looks kind of weak, it could be that it's just time to divide that plant. So what plants can be divided? Many herbaceous perennials can be divided. Plants that produce close-knit shoots or buds, forming a clump of growth. Some suckering shrubs and trees can be divided. Plants that produce offsets or runners. Plants that have rhizomatous roots like bamboo or hops. And once you see some of these plants and you start to know what to look for, you should pretty easily be able to tell whether or not a plant is dividable just with a quick inspection. So some popular plants that are suitable for division would be mints, very easy to divide, monarda, French tarragon, lemon balm, oregano, thyme, fennel, lovage, iris, echinacea, goldenrod, some salvias, yarrow, ornamental grasses, rudbeckia, anise hyssop, and more. And again, some of these are pictured here. Anise hyssop up front, fantastic bee plant, just covered in bees, long bloomer, great for teas, and easily dividable. So how do you divide plants? Well, you can simply dig them up and separate them. Some you could dig down and separate without digging up the whole plant, but either way is going to be effective. Now, I recommend doing this when the plant is not active. So either in early spring or fall are great times to divide plants. And after you dig it up, you simply sever an offshoot or runner and try to sever it as close to the main clump as possible, trying to be sure that that has some roots on it. And after that, it's ready to set out in the landscape or pot up into a pot. Here we have goldenrod. This is what it looked like before in the pot. You can see it has many multiple tops on there. So we just tip the pot out and split it in half. And we would be able to get more divisions out of it as well. But that quickly gave us 2 plants out of the 1. Here's some pineapple mint. And this was a small pineapple mint that we tipped out and we were able to get 3 divisions out of. And they're all very nicely well rooted. They all have great top growth on them. So these are going to root a pot or grow in the ground really quickly. So again, division is a great way to get a few plants going very quickly. We divide a lot of plants during root harvest. There's a lot of plants that their roots make great medicine. We have echinacea, elecampane, marshmallow, to name a few. And when you're harvesting for roots, you don't need to sacrifice the whole plant when you harvest it. You can divide them. And so when we do that, we wait till fall as the foliage is dying back and the energy has worked its way back into the roots. That's a great time to harvest roots for medicine. So you can dig the plant up. We typically harvest about 2/3 of the roots, and then we place it back in the ground and it'll continue to grow. One other thing to remember is you mostly want to divide mature plants. Here I have some examples of some very young plants being divided, but especially out in the landscape, it's best to divide plants that are a few years old and nice and vigorous out there. And so, as I mentioned, we'd be quick on division. And so I'm kind of going to wrap it up there. Again, it's pretty straightforward. And again, if you have any more questions on it, feel free to email me or leave them for the end of the talk, and we'll see about addressing your questions on division. So the next thing I want to talk about, and a very exciting thing, is rooting cuttings. And I'm sure a lot of you are here for this part. So again, I'm going to go into a lot of detail. It's going to be hard to cover it. It's hard to talk about propagation in an hour and a half. In fact, occasionally we'll give some hands-on propagation classes out here that are 24 hours, 3 days, 8 hours, and still feel like we didn't cover it all. So we're kind of going to fly through this. Definitely put in questions in the comments, and we'll see if we can get them all answered. So rooting cuttings, how does it work? And how do you root a cutting, and why would you? Cuttings at the moment seem to be the most sought after or desirable form of propagation. I get a lot of questions about rooting cuttings. There's definitely some mystery to it, how you can, sever a part of the plant and have it produce roots. It's kind of amazing. So how is it that these plants form roots from a cutting? Well, a lot of plants have an amazing ability to regenerate roots from stems, leaf, or bud tissue. These are known as adventitious roots. And it actually happens because there are growth cells close to the vascular, which is the sap carrying tissue of the plant, that can actually change and become root initials. And root initials are basically root cells, and these will form root buds and eventually roots. Still a mystery, even though we kind of know how it happens with cells converting, but it's still a fascinating process. There's a lot of plants, including many in the Lamiaceae family, such as lavender and rosemary, that actually have dormant root initials in the stem, so they root quickly and easily. Some plants are much more difficult to root, and for many reasons. One could be that they callus over, which prevents rooting. And so why would we take a cutting? Well, the big reason is because it's going to be an exact clone of the parent plant, and it's going to have little or no variation in the flower color or growth. And earlier we were talking about seeds, how they can have variation, lavender being one of them. If you start lavender seed, it's not going to come true to type. That's actually a big problem in the industry. A lot of growers have started many lavender, especially Munstead and Hidcote have been seed starts. And now these plants are out there and they are not true Munstead or true Hidcote. And then people take cuttings off of them and sell them as Munstead or Hidcote, and it just causes confusion. So if you want an exact clone of the plant, whether it's lavender or a variegated salvia, you want to take a cutting because that's going to be a perfect match. Another reason is you can get many cuttings off of one mother plant. Depending on the variety or the plant, there's some lavender plants, if they're healthy and young, I could get 150 cuttings off of one plant. Other ones I struggle to find a cutting on, and of course it seems like they're always the popular varieties, but you could usually find them. So that's another reason, is you can get a whole lot of plants propagated, and they're all going to be hopefully identical. So there's many different types of cuttings. There's softwood cuttings, greenwood cuttings, semi-ripe cuttings, hardwood cuttings, leaf and leaf bud cuttings, and root cuttings. Today, we're mainly going to focus on softwood and greenwood cuttings and semi-ripe and hardwood cuttings, kind of grouped into two different categories here. Now, I'm going to start pointing out some of these pictures of these cuttings so you can all kind of get an idea of what a good cutting would look like. This here is a willow tree, and on the left would be before this cutting was cleaned up, and on the right is a cleaned up cutting ready to go. We'll dive more into nodes and where to take the cuttings, but you can see we've got a lot of nodes on the stem here, good growth, good length. So this is what it was before, and this is a cutting that's ready to be plugged in of willow. And willow roots are really fast. And we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. So softwood and greenwood cuttings, they're typically taken from spring through summer. Softwood and greenwood cuttings root very quickly, but they are higher maintenance. One reason is they're actively growing, they have a lot of foliage, the sun is out in spring, so they perspire and they dry out quicker. And in my opinion, it just takes much longer to get a nice robust plant out of a softwood cutting. We kind of typically don't take softwood cuttings. There are some trees and shrubs that really only want to root from a softwood cutting. And so a softwood cutting is going to be that very active growth as the stems are stretching and pushing out in spring. The stem is still real soft. That's a spring softwood cutting, and they do root fast, so it is good. It can be good to practice with them, but in the long run, in my opinion, they just don't grow quite as a robust plant. If we do take softwood cuttings, I pretty much assume that those cuttings are going to have to overwinter in the greenhouse. So it's a long process. You know, usually you're caring for them for a year in a pot before they're robust enough to sell or plant in the garden. This here is a pelargonium or a scented geranium. This is a rose scented geranium. And this I would consider a softwood cutting. It was taken a little late, so they do get softer than this. But again, on the left here is the cutting initially taken from the plant. And this one here is cleaned up and ready to be stuck. You can see a couple leaves were removed. A fresh cut was made. We've got a few nodes that will go in the medium and then some nice growth up top. So next is the semi-ripe and hardwood cuttings. These cuttings are taken from late summer into autumn and even into winter. They are much more robust, much less prone to drying out. They can take longer to root. And because of that, you know, they will have lower success. Now, part of the lower success is only because they take longer to root. It takes much more to keep them happy for that long. Again, it's all about the environment and keeping them happy. So the longer you have to deal with trying to keep them happy, the more there is a chance of them drying out or being too wet, which can affect rooting. Otherwise, I've seen just about as good a success with the semi-ripe and hardwood cuttings as the spring softwood. I mentioned that these days we really only take semi-ripe and hardwood cuttings, especially for our lavender. There are, again, a few exceptions, but lavender these days, we only take semi-ripe and hardwood cuttings from autumn into winter. In fact, right now is cutting season, and I've been filling trays with lavender. It's a great time to take lavender cuttings. They seem to grow up stronger and more robust, as I said, just a much better plant overall. Here we have a cutting of quince. And this is a really beautiful plant and a beautiful cutting here. This is how it was severed from the plant. And then this is cleaned up. Now, one thing I want to point out on this quince cutting is if you look close at the bottom, and I apologize if you can't see it, this is actually what I would call a heel cutting. And heel cuttings are great. A heel cutting is where instead of making a cut on the stem, you actually peel it off of the stem. If you look close at this cutting, you can see that you've got some main stem and then an offshoot, and this cutting is actually an offshoot. So if you can peel that cutting off of the main stem and maintain a little bit of that hard bark growth, that's got a lot of energy in it, and it'll really assist in rooting. So if I can get a heel cutting on shrubs or even lavender, I'll do it. Of course, for me, it's more about getting a good cutting than making sure I have that heel. But if you can get the heel, that's got a lot of energy and a really nice cutting. Another thing you may notice is this one I've clipped the leaves on. I've cut them halfway. You know, this for me really is about space. You can fit them in tighter. When you're putting your cuttings in trays, you don't want them overlapping too much. You really don't want the leaves or foliage touching the medium either. So that would be a good time to cut the leaves. So I definitely want to say again, and this was the same for seeds, but I want to emphasize it, that when you're taking and rooting cuttings, the most important factor in finding success is providing a supportive environment for the cutting to survive, root, and thrive. It's less about taking the right cutting in the right spot at the right time of year and more about keeping them happy once cut from the parent plant. Absolutely critical. You can take the best cutting, but if your medium's not right, or if they dry out, you're not going to find success. So by far, that's the most important part. Once you start to see the good cuttings, you'll be spotting them on every plant, and that will no longer be the issue as far as how to take the cutting. And it'll really come down to the supportive environment to get them to root. So let's talk about medium. And this kind of is very similar to the seeds, but now we're talking about cuttings. So again, there's many different mediums that would work, but I recommend using a sterile, well-drained medium. Sterile is important. I've rooted cuttings in living soil and in, you know, definitely not sterile soil, so it's possible. But especially if you're beginning taking cuttings, if this is new or if you're struggling, I would recommend a sterile medium. It's really going to help. When you cut that cutting, you are opening up a big wound and just inviting pathogens in there. So the more you could cut back on those pathogens, the better success you'll have. A great mix for cuttings is basically the same mix we made for seeds: 1 part perlite and 1 part peat moss. Once the cuttings are rooted, I say bring on the microbes for sure and introduce those beneficial microbes. But until they're rooted, treat them delicately, go for sterile. It'll make things much easier. Even we use sterile medium here. Now you can tweak the medium. People use all different sorts of mediums for propagating. So again, there is no one right answer. You can find equal success in propagating in this medium as you can to a different one. Sometimes the blend would depend on how much time you could spend on monitoring the cutting. If you work away from home, so the cuttings will be left all day without monitoring, you can make your medium a little bit more water retaining. That way it holds the moisture a little bit better. If you're around and can monitor them a lot, you could go more well drained. Here, it's my job. I'm with these cuttings all day, every day. So we use an incredibly fast draining medium, and I just provide them with the moisture and the water that they need. A lot of people will use sand, peat moss and sand, which is absolutely great and fine. I have rooted cuttings in sand, and it works just as well as peat and perlite. We've moved away from sand mainly because we have clay soil here on the farm and in the garden. And if you're not aware of the issue of adding sand to clay, that would be a worthy use of your time, especially if you have clay soil in your garden or your farm. It can be very bad to add sand to that clay. Now we compost it first. If the sand is in the medium and it finds its way to the compost and then the garden, most likely it's going to be fine. It's such a small amount of sand, but it's something that we just choose to avoid. Likewise, I do not like perlite getting into the permanent landscape for many other reasons, but you got to end up picking something. So, so once you have your medium figured out, then it's time to prepare your containers. And again, this is pretty similar to the seeds with one little small exception here. Again, you can use nursery pots, cells, cell trays or flats. You want to fill your medium, and then for the cuttings, I like to really firm it down nice and tight. You don't want to use all your might and press it down as much as you can, but you really want a nice firm medium. And then water it well, the same way we did for the seeds. So fill that medium up to field capacity, let the water run off. You want a heavy tray. So again, feel it when it's dry and then feel it when it's light, and really get the difference in the weight. You want a really nice, well-saturated tray before you start putting your cuttings in it. You don't want to put your cuttings into the dry medium. And then label, definitely label, again, especially if it's lavender varieties. We grow over 125 different varieties of lavender here, and a lot of them look the same in cutting trays. So it's very important that we label. We'll put the species, the variety, and the date that the cutting was taken, and we put it, a couple of them in each tray just to be sure. We even use different colors. So yeah, labeling is super important. Cell trays do work great, especially if you're just taking a few cuttings, because then each cutting has its own cell, and it can be easier to get that out once they're rooted. But it's pretty easy in 4-inch pots as well. So now that we've got our medium figured out and our container prepared, let's talk a little bit more detail about actually taking the cutting. So one very important thing is you want to use clean, sharp shears. Very clean, very sharp. Clean because you do not want to introduce pathogens. Remember, you are severing a part of this plant and opening up a wound, and you want it sterile. You don't want anything getting in there. And the reason for sharp is because if you have dull shears or pruners, you are going to crush the stem more than cut it. And when you crush the stem, you are crushing plant cells. And if you remember back to why these things will root, it's because we have cells that convert. And so we need as many cells as we can get. We want to keep those cells happy. And so you want a good, clean cut. I sharpen my shears very regularly. I clean them constantly, multiple times a day. And especially if I'm switching to a different plant or different species, I'll clean them with isopropyl alcohol in between moving around varieties or species. And sharpening maybe about once a week. It really depends. You'll notice if you've got a great clean cut and then all of a sudden you cut it and there's a little piece of stem that's hanging off, or it feels like it pinched it more, it's definitely time to sharpen. Next would be to choose a healthy plant. Just like seeds, we want to start good from the beginning. We want to look for a healthy plant with healthy cuttings. We don't want to take cuttings from a weak plant. Maybe if we're desperate to save that particular variety or something, we'll take some, but really you want a good strong plant and good strong cuttings. When you're choosing your cutting, a great length to shoot for is about 4 to 6 inches long, and you want as many nodes on there as possible. And I mentioned nodes earlier, so I'll explain the nodes a little bit more. Here we have Salvia iodantha, and a node is simply the spot on the stem where the leaves or buds form. So here, starting at the bottom, you can see each one of these is a node, and especially where the leaves are, those are all nodes. So on a great cutting, you want as many nodes as possible. A lot of rooting will occur from those nodes. And so the more you can get, the better. I try to strive for at least 2 nodes in my medium and at least 2 or 3 above. You can get cuttings to root with 1 node in the medium and 1 node above, but it's just going to be tougher and it's going to take longer for that plant to grow out nicely. So, try to go for as many nodes as possible. If you find stems that are very stretched out and don't have a lot of nodes, that's not going to make a good cutting. You want them stacked on top of each other and nice and tight. So once you've identified your good cutting with lots of nodes, usually this is active growth, or in fall and winter, it's the growth that's going to start fading out. It's time to take the cutting, and I typically take them a little long. So going back to this salvia again, you can see this is what I cut from the plant, and then I cleaned it up to be a little bit shorter. I took off a few leaves, I snipped that active top off, and I cut it at a 45-degree angle. So when you're ready to stick your cutting it at a 45-degree angle really helps. That helps expose more of the cambium layer, which is where a lot of rooting can take place. So if I'm cutting off of the plant knowing I'm going to trim it, I'll give it a straight cut, and then right before I stick it, I'll cut it at a 45. If you're cutting right off of the plant to go right into your tray, then you want to try to cut it at a 45-degree angle just below a node, and that's really going to help. And then you always want to strip the bottom leaves. You don't want any leaves in your medium to prevent contamination. And then even if the leaves are going to be touching the medium, like here on this salvia, you can cut your leaves either off or trim them up to keep them up above that medium. And also cutting at the 45 will help the cutting increase its moisture intake. It's absolutely critical to keep these cuttings full of moisture. The moment you cut that plant, that cutting is going to start drying out, and we need that moisture for the rooting to happen. So the bigger you can get your angle, the more it's going to uptake that moisture as well. And then the next step would be to wound the cutting. Now, I don't do this on all cuttings. This one here you can see has a wound on it. One kind of general rule when determining whether or not you should be wounding your cutting is the harder the wood is on the growth, the more you're going to want to wound it. If you've got dark woody growth that you're sticking into the medium, you definitely want to wound that stem. And by wound it, you can I use my pruners. You can also take a razor blade, and you want to scratch away some of that woody part and get down to that cambium layer. Definitely not too deep. So again, this is one of those kind of arts of propagation, is how far to wound it. I recommend starting out slow and taking your time and getting the feel of it. And then the softwood, if they're real softwood cuttings, I usually don't scrape them at all if they're real greenwood or softwood. And then there are a lot of plants that have hollow stems, some salvias and things like that, some verbenas. And those, if you definitely don't want to scratch and get into that hollow part. So again, it's important to know your plant. Lavender does not have hollow stems, so go ahead and scrape your lavender. You can even scrape the softwood, but again, remember that you're opening up a bigger wound for possible attack on pathogens. So if it's hardwood, definitely scar down to the cambium layer. If it's softwood, your choice. I usually choose not to. And then so here is where my method differs greatly. So now we've got this beautifully prepped cutting. We've got it cut at an angle and we've got it scarred. So most literature and most people will tell you this is the point where you use rooting hormone. Now, I do not use any commercial rooting hormone, and I don't use much rooting hormone at all, to be honest. There's some years I will use it and other years that I do not. I've got thousands of cuttings lined up in the greenhouse, and I have not used any rooting hormone. Now, when I do use a rooting hormone, again, I don't buy a commercial rooting hormone or a man-made chemical. Now, if you remember back to chemistry class, people and plants make and use their own chemicals. So oftentimes organic gardeners will just freak out at the word chemical and think it's bad. They're not always totally bad. It's just something we choose not to do, especially because there are plants that produce great natural rooting hormones in them. So for us, buying a manufactured product in a plastic bottle that was shipped, for our convenience, it just doesn't seem too convenient for the environment and something that we choose not to do. Most home growers, one bottle of rooting hormone is going to last a long time, and it will help increase the rate at which your plants root. So it can be good to use, and whether you make your own or buy it commercially, it's going to be up to you, but we regularly root cuttings without any rooting hormone at all. Now, when we do use rooting hormone, again, I choose to go to one made in nature. And so we look to willow trees. Willow trees are fantastic for many things. And one thing in particular is making your own rooting hormone. Willows are rich in a hormone called indolbutyric acid, or IBA. And now if you look at a commercially produced rooting hormone, most of the time it is indolbutyric acid. And so one is made by man, one is made by nature. And it's simply an auxin hormone that stimulates root growth. So they will stimulate that root growth, and your cutting can root faster and more vigorously by applying these indolbutyric acids, whether from a bottle or from a plant. Willow is also high in salicylic acid, and for cuttings, this can act as an antifungal, which is great, again, because you're wounding it, so that antifungal can prevent funguses. And in people, it can be used for pain relief. In fact, aspirin was originally made from isolating salicylic acid from the bark of willow trees back in the late 1800s. So the willow has been around and useful. People have been using willow for that for thousands of years. So really useful plants all around, but makes a fantastic rooting hormone. So I'll real quickly tell you how I make a willow rooting hormone and how to use it. It's really simple. If you have a willow tree, most species of willows will do just fine. And you want to find young branches, preferably first year's growth, that are maybe the thickness of a pencil. And you want to strip off all the leaves and then cut or shred into small pieces. Now we make a lot when we do make it. So I use a 5-gallon bucket, and I'll fill that about 3/4 full of willow shavings. And then I'll cover with cold, fresh, clean water. Clean water is important. So if you're on city water where there could be chlorine or other chemicals in it, you can fill a bucket and let that sit for 24 to 36 hours, and most of those chemicals will kind of work themselves out, and then you can make your willow tea out of it. So simply cover your willow branches and keep for a few days. I'll stir it a couple times a day as I'm walking past, and I keep it covered with a screen. And then after a few days, you simply strain out the willow branches. You can add those to your compost, and then you've got willow tea or willow water. From there, I like to dilute to a 1-to-1 ratio. So I'll use a 2-gallon watering can and I'll put a gallon of willow water in there. And then I'll put a gallon of fresh, clean water. And from there, I'll water in my cuttings. You can also use this as a dip, as the way you would most commercial rooting hormones. So you can have a little jar and dip your cutting in it before you stick it, or you can stick all your cuttings and then water it in. But these auxin hormones will really help with rooting, and just so happens that willow produces these for us, which is really great. So that's kind of my rant on rooting hormone. So whether you choose to use it or not, at this point, you've got your cutting ready to stick. So you want to place it in your medium, and what you're going for is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of stem in that medium. And hopefully, again, you'll have at least 2 nodes, if not more, in that medium as well, with a couple inches and a few nodes above. Now, once you stick your cutting, you want to really snug it in there. Use your fingers and kind of push both sides and press it down quite a bit and snug it up and give it that sense of place. You do not want it loose, so make it tight. Again, at this point, your medium should have been well watered, so it should have good moisture in it when you're pressing it. But even then, again, once you get all your cuttings in and they're nice and firm, you want to water that tray really well. Again, almost or to the point of runoff and field capacity. Overwatering your cuttings is certainly an issue, but not for the initial water in. You really want to make sure everything's settled and watered really well. So let's take a look at a few more examples of some cuttings. These are lavender cuttings. And these I would consider semi-ripe cuttings. These are what you'll see growing, most of the year. Actually, in early spring, they'll be a little more reachy and green, but this time of year, this is what you'll usually see on your plants. Now, this is actually 2 cuttings on 1 stem. And so again, a lot of times I will cut the main stem and then work with my cuttings off of that. Especially if you're going to get a heel cutting, which again, if you look close at the bottom of this one, this is a heel cutting where it was peeled away from the stem. If you're going for the heel cutting, you definitely want to sever the main branch and then peel after it's cut. If you peel your cutting off of your main plant, you're exposing a big wound that can, cause issues. And so make a good clean cut and then from there peel. So this is what it looked like cut off the plant. And this is 1 cutting still left on the stem that needs to be peeled off. And then this one has been peeled off and prepped. Kind of hard to see, but you can see we've got a few good nodes on there. We've got the heel, and then I also clipped the top, but we've still got 3 or 4 really good nodes up top. This cutting over here on the right, now this is of Sharon Roberts. And if you're familiar with that variety of lavender, it's a stunning variety that blooms beautifully in fall. Even in our little bit chillier climate, we typically get almost a full fall bloom out of the Sharon Roberts. So this here is more reminiscent of what a spring softwood cutting would be, because this is an active flower stem. Now, if you notice towards the top, it's kind of brown and there's no flower. It's because we've already had our first frost. We've actually had a few. And so the frost really wiped those flowers out pretty quickly. But this is a nice long stretched out stem that had a flower on it. And this would make a beautiful cutting. So again, this is what I cut off the plant. I usually always cut them long and then trim them up right as I'm sticking them in the medium. Another reason also is because you're pruning the plant at the same time. So if you only cut this cutting, you may end up with a little bit too tall of a stem, and come spring when the plant breaks dormancy, that area may get a little top heavy and a little floppy, especially on this particular variety, Sharon Roberts, which happens to be a bit more of a looser grower to begin with. So cut your stem long and then clean it up. So this is what it looked like when it was first cut. And then this is cleaned up here where it's cut at a 45-degree angle below a node. I've got a couple nice nodes, a couple really nice growth nodes up top, and then I've cut that flower stem off. Now this one, being that it was more towards the green side, as you can see, I did not scar this cutting. I just stuck it just how it was without scarring. Again, scarring isn't going to be detrimental. You can definitely do it, but on these greener cuttings, it does not need it. So here we have some what I would consider lavender hardwood cuttings, and I love these cuttings. They could definitely take longer to root, but really nice, good, robust cuttings. Now, once again, this is 2 cuttings, and you can see how I've cut the main stem just below. You could make your 45-degree cut right down here, right at the stem, and that'd be totally fine. In fact, you might even get some new growth off of there come spring. But this is just how I chose to do it on this plant. I cut the main stem nice and clean, and now I've got 2 cuttings to work with. This is one of those cuttings cleaned up. And so on this particular one, you can see we've got a lot of nodes on there. I mean, it's really stacked tight, which is really great. This particular one was cut at a 45-degree angle below a node, and you can't see it, but I did scar this one. It might be on the back. So when I scarred it, it's really only about a 1/4 inch long, maybe a 1/2 inch long wound, and just right down to that cambium layer. And then I also clipped off part of the top. You can see on this one how you have beautiful tight stacked nodes. And then right here, you've got this goofy little stem with this little growth. I like to get rid of that. Again, when it breaks dormancy in spring, this is going to grow out and up and kind of make a goofy top heavy plant. So I like to keep everything real tight. Make sure your top nodes are nice and tight. That'll help with a really good, even uniform plant and a lot of nodes. So this one's definitely ready to stick, and a beautiful hardwood lavender cutting. Now here's a red twig dogwood cutting on the right. And again, cut the main branch, and you've got 2 cuttings here. And these make great heel cuttings. You can see that huge heel that I got on that. And sometimes when the heel is that big, I'll trim it up. You know, as long as you have some of that heel with some of the bark on there, it's got that energy, and it'll really assist in rooting and moisture uptake. And again, keeping these cuttings moist is key. You can see that these cuttings are fairly stretched out. There's not a lot of nodes. And so by keeping that heel, you know, I've got a really good part in the medium and then some growth nodes above. Sometimes with the dogwoods, I will snip the tip, but other times I leave them. Dogwood roots fairly readily, so you can kind of get away with a few things on there. So next up, I have a rosemary cutting. And this kind of shows you 3 stages. And I like this cutting because you could kind of see the transition. So again, this is what it was on the plant. And so this is what you're looking for. You're looking for that nice, long, reachy growth with a lot of nodes stacked up as far as what's going to make a good cutting. Now here it is, same cutting, just with the whole bottom part stripped off. And you can see that the bottom part's really kind of got that brown woody look. And then about here, it starts transitioning into that green wood. So this is a perfect example of a semi-ripe cutting, almost a hardwood cutting. And this will root really beautifully. And so right here, I've trimmed that stem up. You don't want that stem too long in your medium. You know, 1 inch to 1.5 inches, as long as you've got a few nodes, which we've got some beautiful nodes here. We've got a nice 45-degree angle right under the node. And then I also snipped the tip on this one. Now, I forgot to mention, and I'll say that when you're putting your cuttings in your medium, you really want the medium to go up to the growth. You don't want to put your growth into the medium, because again, that could rot out or introduce problems. But you also don't want a lot of stems sticking out of your medium. There's a lot of plants where new growth will sprout out from down below, but sometimes it won't right away. And so you're left with a real top heavy, almost bonsai looking plant that you've got your soil and then a lot of stem and then the plant above it. So when you're sticking your cuttings, try to get them right down close to the foliage in the medium. Here is a couple examples of some bad lavender cuttings. So this particular one here would be considered a hardwood cutting. We've got that real woody growth on there. A lot of growth on top. So there's a lot of energy up here, a lot of different tops and nodes. And then there's really only one node down on the stem, which would be this little branching deal here. This cutting would root. If you cut it at a 45 below that node and you scar that hardwood down to the cambium layer, you could get this cutting to root. It's going to take a while because, again, there's just so much energy up here that to try to get it to focus down low might be challenging. And it's not going to be a very strongly rooted cutting. And because there's so much top growth, you're going to need a big root system to support that, and it won't have it with this kind of stem. So again, if you're absolutely desperate to save a variety for some reason, you can get this to root, but certainly not a recommended cutting. Here's another what I would consider bad cutting, and this one has a few growth nodes that could be put into the medium. We could strip these off and you would have a few nodes here, but then you've got this really long part of the stem that doesn't have any nodes and kind of a little bit of a goofy top growth on there. So again, this cutting would and could root, but it's going to be more challenging, and it's going to be a lesser quality of a plant, not as robust and not well shaped. We like to grow good hardy plants that are well shaped from the beginning. Again, it's just less maintenance. And when you're growing thousands of plants, you don't want to spend a lot of time pruning or caring for the goofy ones. So these would be the cuttings that I would pass up. Although again, they could possibly root. So when taking cuttings, there's a few optional things. Rooting hormone, which we talked about, and I was talking about willow tree, which this is some willow branch right here. This is right outside our greenhouse. So it's free, abundant rooting hormone. And these are the branches pre-stripped. You can see you strip the leaves off and cut them up and make your willow tea out of that. Really easy, really convenient, and just one of the many powers of the beautiful willow tree. Heat mats as well. You can see these cuttings are sitting on a heat mat, and this pot has 3 rosemary cuttings and 3 lavender cuttings. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see how the foliage goes right down to the medium, but it's not buried in it. We've got good top growth above. We've got them labeled with the species, variety, and dates, and I've got my soil thermometer in there to monitor the soil temperature. Humidity domes as well. You can use humidity domes for cuttings. We don't ever use humidity domes for cuttings, although you do want to keep the top growth moist. And so again, if you don't have as much time to spend on monitoring your cuttings, the humidity domes can be useful. Just make sure you're venting them regularly, and once the cuttings form roots, you want to remove them completely. And then misters, we don't use misters. I do mist my cuttings in a way, either with a squirt bottle or with a hose to keep that foliage moist. But we don't have a mister set up where they turn on every 20 minutes and mist the cuttings. If you are using misters, just be sure that nothing's staying too wet and that there's not watering your medium to a point to where your medium is being overwatered by your misters. Your medium should remain the correct moisture while the top is just getting a light mist. So those are a few optional things. And now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about watering, because again, this is going to be the most critical part. We went over a lot about how to take the right type of cutting, what makes a good cutting. But honestly, it's going to come down to keeping them happy. By far the most important part. And here's the challenge of it, and the part that can be frustrating is the amount of water and the frequency varies greatly. It's going to depend on the time of year you took the cutting, your environment, including whether or not you're using bottom heat, the ambient room temperature, your medium. There is no set schedule for watering cuttings, unfortunately. So you really have to learn how to observe and know what you're looking for to know when and how much to water. Overwatered cuttings will rot out, and cuttings that get too dry will dry out. So it's really about keeping them happy and finding that happy medium. It can be a challenge. So definitely, again, focus on the signs and know what to look for, which we'll cover a little bit. So for watering your cuttings, again, when you first stick them, you want to do a really good initial watering to the point of runoff. That tray should be pretty well saturated. It should be heavy. Remember that weight. And if it starts feeling light, it might need water. Again, you should be checking the top of your medium and the bottom. If the top looks like it's drying out, check the bottom. If your tray is still heavy and the bottom looks wet, you may just need to lightly mist the top. You don't want to assume that if the top is dry, that your tray is wet. That could lead to overwatering very quickly. Now, also, so for the first few weeks, we could assume that these cuttings do not have roots. And so for these first few weeks, that the cuttings do not have roots, you want to keep your tray and your foliage more towards the wet side. Earlier, when we were talking about seeds, we wanted it moist. So for cuttings, for the first few weeks, you want it wet, but not soaking. There is a pretty big difference between wet and soaking. So again, if we think about the sponge, a good medium for cuttings in the first few weeks would be where you can hold the sponge up and no water is dripping off. But when you squeeze that sponge, you get a decent stream of water. So it's holding a lot of water, but it's not dripping and soaking wet. That's kind of the goal for the first few weeks. The other thing is keeping the top growth or the foliage moist. And so this could be a challenge. Again, if your tray is up to moisture, but your top is drying out because the sun's out, you want to wet that foliage, but you do not want to apply any more moisture to your tray. And so for that, one of these squirt bottles on the mist setting is fantastic, or a hose on the mist setting, but really try to just lightly wet the foliage without adding any water to your tray. Now, if your tray needs water, if you look at the top and it looks dry, if you look at the bottom and it seems dry, and you feel the weight and it's feeling lighter, then you could water them in either with a hose or a watering can, and you'll be watering the top and the tray at the same time. Now, again, when the whole tray needs water, you can water to the point of runoff. You don't want to completely soak it to where it's running off gallons of water, but I like to give it a good watering and then let it sit. If you get some runoff, great. If you don't, great. Check it again. If it can hold a little bit more water, put a little bit more water on there. You can always add more water, but once your tray is over wet and saturated, it's hard to take that water away. You know, you've got good drainage holes, but still it'll stay saturated for a while, and you do not want that complete wet saturation. You also want to avoid standing water. And so if you're growing on a flat table or if you're using heat mats, you want to check and make sure that there's no pooling water underneath your tray. And so one great way to water is to remove your tray from the heat mat or the table and water it, and then let any runoff run off, and then put it back onto your heat mat. I'll usually go out after a watering and lift up my trays, and if I see any standing water, I'll wipe it off and get that out of there. So again, we're going for wet, but definitely not soaking, and no standing water. It shouldn't be a wet, oozy mess, but should definitely be moist in the medium and the top. You want to check this very often. Again, it's going to, your environment is going to vary greatly from one person to the other. So there will be no schedule. I can't say you need to water them every 3 days or every 4 days. It's really going to depend. There are some days when the sun's out in the greenhouse where I'm misting or lightly watering the top 2 or 3 times. And sometimes I may go for a week without misting the top if it's cold and overcast. So really knowing what to look for and monitoring is going to be key. Now, once they start developing roots, after a few weeks or to a month, then you want to change the watering. And again, this is where it could get tricky with cuttings, is there's no one answer for it. When they're not rooted and young, you want to lean towards the wet side. But once they start putting on roots, you want to back that water off a little bit. And especially once they're well rooted, you want to mainly treat them as you would the parent plant. And so for lavender, once I know the cutting is starting to get roots, I back the moisture off on the medium to kind of what we were looking for in seeds, where again, if you imagine a sponge, it's not dripping, and when you squeeze it, you only get a few drops of water out of that sponge. That's good for once the cuttings have rooted. Also, once they start rooting, you can back off of misting or keeping the top growth moist. That is really to help them intake as much moisture as they can. Once they start developing roots, they're able to drink enough water from that medium that you no longer need to worry about constantly misting the top. So it's going to change throughout the process. Now you might ask how you know if your cuttings are starting to root. There's a couple ways to check. Let me switch slides here. So one way is to kind of lightly tug or twist on the cutting. You do not want to do this too hard, because if the cutting is just starting to develop roots, you could break those roots. But a very gentle twist or a very gentle tug should be able to tell you if that cutting feels grabbed on. Then you're starting to develop roots. If it feels very loose, then you don't have roots yet, and you want to continue to keep things towards the wet side, but not soaking. Keep that foliage moist. Now, if you another great way, and that's super exciting, is soon you will hopefully see roots growing out of the bottom of your container. Like this one here, we've got some beautiful roots growing out the bottom. So I'm pretty confident that these cuttings are rooted. Once they're well rooted like this, it changes once again. So as they just start to root, there's no visible roots coming from the bottom. Maybe you're 30 days in, so they are rooted, but not strongly rooted. You want everything moist, but not wet. You can cut back on misting the top. But once they're well rooted, for me, in my growing practice, it's time to start treating them as a regular plant. And again, for lavender specifically, that means basically letting the tray almost dry out a little bit in between waterings. Lavender is a big fan of deep, infrequent waterings. You don't want that medium to remain moist. And that's even for my well-rooted cuttings once they're well-rooted. Once that tray is well-rooted, I will remove them from the heat mats and put that lavender in a cold part of my greenhouse and let them be dormant. And I cut way back on the watering and let them dry out a bit. We encourage our lavender to go dormant. It's what they want to do. It's the natural rhythm. Again, we don't use any artificial lights or heat except for the heat mats, which we promptly remove once they're rooted. And this really encourages the plant to stay dormant and go through the process. And then they break dormancy and start growing when they want and not when they're forced to. And this really helps build a strong plant, especially when it comes to lavender. We grow for a lot of growers all around the country, some who are pushing the limits on their growing zones and growing these lavenders in very cold regions. And we want our lavender to be tough. I would rather have a smaller start that was tough and adapted to the cold than a big, beautiful, lush plant that was grown in artificial conditions that once you set out, it just doesn't know what to do because it hasn't experienced the real world. So most of our lavender plants that we ship out or sell here have been below freezing temperatures in the greenhouse, either as a cutting or in the pot. And to us, that's important. And so once your cuttings are well rooted, you've monitored the soil, you kept it happy, kept it on the wet side in the beginning, backed off the watering a bit once they developed roots. It's time to pot them up. And this is a super exciting part. Love potting up cuttings. It's a busy time of year. We start early. Again, we're very much on a schedule here. So we typically start potting in late January. That way the plants have a few months to grow and root their pots before we send them out. And so it's freezing cold when we're potting these plants up, but lavender's tough and they'll handle it. There are some cautions you want to take here and there about timing, but we definitely keep everything natural and pretty cold, which is a little bit different from how some nurseries do it. So once you have your well-rooted cuttings, it's time to prepare your potting mix. Again, this is going to be slightly different than your propagation mix. At this point is where we introduce life to the potting mix. Beneficial microbes, we'll use compost, mycorrhizal fungi, a little bit of nutrients in there. You don't want too many nutrients right at first. It is still a delicate cutting, but a time where you can start feeding it a little bit and giving it a little bit more. The potting mix is going to depend greatly on the plant. For lavender, we do a very well-drained potting mix that still has a lot of organic content. When it comes to growing lavender in the greenhouse is completely different than growing it outdoors. The potting mix that we make for lavender, I would not recommend filling a bed with and planting lavender in it outdoors, but to get them started on the right track, it's great. So it's a totally different environment, but we use a living organic soil that has a little bit of nutrients, very well drained, and we pot them up in there. To remove them from the trays, if you're using cell trays, it's very easy. You can just lift the whole plug and pop that in your new pot. If you're using 4-inch pots to root a few cuttings, that could be pretty easy as well. You just tip it over on your fingers as you would a plant that you were going to plant. And because you've made that medium very light and loose, a lot of that medium will just fall away from the roots, and you can kind of tease those cuttings apart and pot them up. It becomes a bit more challenging when you've got a tightly packed tray. In here, you really kind of want to use a fork or a spoon and kind of tease them up, and you'll have to pull them apart. Just remember, if your cutting is well rooted, such as this lavender cutting here on the right, or this phlomis cutting here with spectacular roots, these are 7.5-inch shears. So those are some massive roots on that phlomis. It's fine if a few roots break off. A lot of people are very concerned about the delicacy of roots, which you should be. They are delicate, but they're tough. Remember that this plant created these roots from cutting it off of a mother plant. So if you break a couple roots, they're going to regrow. Obviously, be as gentle as you can, but do what you need to separate them. Often I'll even root prune. I guarantee this phlomis had a little bit of root pruning before it went into the pot. Because when you are potting, I try to avoid having any roots touching the outside of the pots. You want all the roots contained in that soil, and you want to let it grow out to the side of the pots. So that's one thing I look for when I'm potting. And then after that, once they're potted, continue on the same path of treating them well. Some plants want a little bit more water, whereas lavender really likes to dry out. And that's from the beginning. That's, after they've rooted in the cutting trays, and then once they go into the pot as well. So how long do most of these cuttings take? It really depends. Again, on lavender, if you're taking the cuttings in autumn or winter, on average, I usually expect to have roots in about 30 days, sometimes a little bit longer if it's a really hardwood cutting. Some spring greenwood cuttings can root in as little as a couple weeks, so it really depends. Now, again, for us, I'm usually not in a rush. I like to leave my cuttings in the tray for at least 100 days. I'm usually not in a hurry to get them out. I'm really working on timing. And so I want them to be well rooted and strong before I take them out and pot them up. So it's going to depend on your situation. But if you are in a hurry, you can have a decently rooted lavender cutting that's ready to pot up in about 30 days, give or take. But again, for us, we shoot for 100 days or more in that cutting tray before it gets potted up. So that's kind of about wrapping it up. Some common issues with rooting cuttings would be the cuttings do not root. This can simply be because they either dried out too much or they got too wet. Again, either way will really have a negative effect on your cuttings. If they're too wet, they'll rot out. And once that cutting dries out, even if you then correct your moisture, that cutting may just be done for because it got too dry. If you see your cuttings looking healthy and then for some reason they start turning brown or wilting, that can also be rotting. If they had started to root and then the medium got too wet, that can rot the cutting out. That could also unfortunately be a pathogen. If everything looks healthy and you get roots and then you start seeing cuttings dying off, it could be that a pathogen was introduced. So again, go for sanitary conditions, wash your hands, wash your equipment, use your alcohol, use a sterile medium, and try to keep everything sterile until they're very well rooted. And then also if your cutting tray is just looking a little bit gray and dull, that could be too dry as well. And again, once they're dry, they're kind of toast. So that about wraps it up. Again, I skipped over some things just to try to keep it in time. There's a lot that goes into this. The key thing is keeping them happy. So learn your moisture, learn how to monitor it, and make those small adjustments. Keep an eye on them and keep them happy, and they should root for you. So that's all I got.
Jered, that was so good. I can't believe you don't do this all the time. I'm waiting for the YouTube channel. That was just very thorough, very complete. Just really well done. Great pictures.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think you're pulling my leg that you haven't done this before. It was really, really good. Very just excellent.
Well, I love talking about plants, like I said, so it's easy for me to talk about plants for a while.
Yeah, very, very clear. I really appreciated it and learned some new things. So we do have some questions. I'd love to go through these. Rhonda says, Do you recommend sowing the seeds and stratifying them in the container or stratifying the seeds in their packets first?
So it really depends. I'm a fan of stratifying in the medium. Now, I have done where I put damp peat moss in a plastic bag and put the seeds in there in the refrigerator, which can help with issue of possibly getting moldy. So that's another method is, put a little bit of peat moss in a plastic bag and put your seeds in there and then put that in the refrigerator. But I sow it right into my medium at the correct depth and just put that right in there and monitor it. And again, it just saves me a step later on of having to re-get them out. Now, there's a few seeds that need to remain cold. Ginkgo biloba tree, that particular one, when I order seeds and get them in the mail, I do put that seed packet right in the refrigerator to keep them cold. But then to get them going, I still sow them at their correct depth and put them in a cold portion of the greenhouse in the medium.
Okay, great. And then there's a question which I'm not sure. This is a phone number. It's 11802 or just a number, but it says the question is, does similarly apply for houseplants? And I didn't catch where that was, so I'm not sure. Maybe
Okay.
that person can unmute and say what they were saying, if you're, or maybe you got it.
Yeah, well, houseplants is very similar. The great thing is a lot of houseplants are dividable, and a lot of them root very readily and quickly. In fact, one common method for rooting houseplant cuttings is just leaving it in a cup of water on the windowsill, and a lot of them will gain roots, spider plants and things of that sort. I'm not a fan of rooting in water because those roots haven't had anything to struggle with. They just grow loose and airy, and then sometimes when you pot them up, they get compacted around this soil and don't really know what to do. So I still like to root them in a medium. But most houseplants are very easy to either divide or to root with the same process. Now with the houseplants, most of them want to lean a little bit more towards the wet side, from the beginning, propagating, and then once rooted, also keeping them misted. Humidity domes can be good for houseplants to keep them nice and moist and humid.
Okay. How do you recommend checking for dryness at the bottom of the pot?
Your pot should definitely have drainage holes. And again, if you're using something other than a nursery pot, you want to poke drainage holes in it. So that's a great way. Even the 4-inch nursery pots that are pretty standard, they have 4 holes in the bottom on the corners, and those holes are about 3/8 of an inch. That is enough to kind of gaze in there and check. If you're using a flat or cell trays, same thing. They're going to have a hole on the bottom, and you want to physically check it and see. So definitely lift it up, give it a good inspection, use the weight, check that weight. Remember what it feels like when it's well watered and heavy, and that's another way to tell as well.
Okay, good. That's good advice. How many seedlings would you keep in the pot next to the thermometer on the slide that says seeds have sprouted? So it was a lot of little seedlings in there.
Yeah, so each one of those pots was a different species or variety of plant. So again, I use those 4-inch pots, and most seeds that I put in there, I put about 20 seeds in that 4-inch pot. Now, if you space your seedlings correctly and they don't shift around, you may not need to thin. But again, if it's a large seed like squash, typically we recommend direct sowing your squash. But if you are starting a large squash seed, you may only fit 6 seeds in that 4-inch pot. So make sure they're well spaced and planted at the correct depth. And it's just going to vary depending on the seed. Some very small seed, we may get 30 seeds in there. And that small seed, again, is kind of tough. They can really, when you water them, work themselves together. So that's when they sprout, you really want to thin them out and give them their space.
Okay. Then how quickly do cuttings need to be potted after being removed from the plant?
I recommend immediately, the quicker you can, because again, once you sever that cutting from the plant, it's going to start to dry out. Now, there are occasions where you can't stick your cutting right away, whether you're collecting them from a friend's house or you're busy. I still recommend having your tray ready to go. So if you need to wait before you can stick your cutting, I recommend cutting them long and putting them in a plastic bag and then placing them in the refrigerator somewhere cool and dark. and they could store in a plastic bag in the refrigerator for a few days. The main thing is once you take them out, you want to get a fresh cut away from the end and put it right in. So it should always be a fresh cut right as you're putting it in the medium, but you can store them. And sometimes I'll even put one little squirt of water in that plastic bag just to keep everything nice and moist.
Right. Or maybe a damp piece of a damp paper towel or something
Oh yeah,
like that.
that works real well.
Right. Okay. How do you sterilize the medium?
The medium should be sterile. If you're buying bagged peat moss, then that comes sterilized. If you're making your complete own medium and you're not sure that if it's sterilized, you can bake it in the oven. Sometimes your house might smell up a little bit, but if you bake it at 180 degrees for 30 minutes, that's going to sterilize your medium. So you can even use a potting mix that has a lot of nutrients and organic life in it, and you can sterilize it in the oven, or there's other methods that you can look online. But if you're using like a peat perlite mix, that should all be sterile from the factory and be ready to go.
Okay. And then what is wrong with perlite in the landscape?
Oh yeah. I really don't like anything that's unnatural in the landscape. And although perlite, it's expanded volcanic rock, so it is fairly natural, I guess. It occurs naturally, but then it goes through a process to be expanded. But it's extremely lightweight. And so what'll happen is over time, even if you mix that perlite into your soil really well, as your soil gets saturated and beyond field capacity, a lot of that perlite will work itself up and you'll find it on the top. Another reason is because we use so much organic material here, all that organic material is going to break down over time, but the perlite will not. So if you ever look at a pot that used to be full of soil, but now it's 4 inches down from the rim and it looks like it's real heavy perlite on top, that's the reason I don't. It separates and floats and it's not totally natural. So I try to avoid it in the landscape. If you are going to use something like that to improve aeration or structure, even pumice, which is very similar but heavier, could be a better choice than perlite.
Okay. Let's see here. And then what is the best water for willow water? Rain, distilled, or well water?
Rain or well water, definitely. We use well water to water in our cuttings. That's another thing I should have mentioned is even watering in the cuttings, you want to avoid tap water if it's city water with chlorine or any chemicals in it. You can fill a watering can and let that sit and let that kind of go out. But yeah, rainwater is absolutely fantastic. Obviously, you want to be cautious of where you're collecting it off of. If it's your roof, you want to make sure that your roof is clean and not some old 50-year-old tar roof. But well water is fantastic as well.
Okay. And then would coconut coir, I think I'm saying that right, be good substitute for peat moss?
Absolutely. We love using that. Now, one thing is the coconut coir, the pH is a little bit higher on it than peat moss. So again, if you're striving for that acidity, it's going to take you up a little bit higher, but we absolutely have used it with no issues. Having your medium acidic is not a make or break at all. It just slightly benefits. Lavender specifically is not too prone to callousing over, which is one reason to have it slightly acidic for cuttings. So absolutely, you can use that as a replacement for the peat moss. It's great stuff.
Okay, let's see. And then what is the light regime for rooted cuttings?
The light?
Yeah, it's not
I imagine
elaborated on, but maybe should they be in the dark more or
so they're probably
while they're rooting?
referring to grow lights grown indoors, which is fine. Again, I recommend if you can to try to do most things either outside or in the greenhouse. If you are going artificial, try to mimic outside as much as possible. And so, what is your light outside? If you've got 12 hours of light outside, that's kind of what you should be doing on the inside as well. You can push it a little bit, but again, you don't want to push that plant into doing something it's not ready to do. So you definitely don't want to leave your lights on for 18 hours or 24 hours. you may think that that's adding growth and benefiting, but in the long run, it's not going to. So if you're taking your cuttings in autumn where you're only getting 10 to 12 hours of light a day, I would try to mimic that indoors, as well as the temperature indoors. Try to keep it on the cool side. You can absolutely find success by having a 72-degree room with 65% humidity and 18 hours of light. But again, that plant's not going to be as well adapted to the real world when you do put it out there. So with the light, try to mimic what's going on outside.
Okay. Let's see here. Can you share your potting up mix?
Potting up, yeah. So it's actually a pretty complicated mix because again, we do use a living soil. It does have all the basic ingredients. So I do use pumice instead of perlite in all my mixes for kind of reasons that we shared. I use perlite in propagation, but I use pumice in my mixes. So most of my mixes is a blend of peat, cocoa coir, pumice as the main things. And then I add a bunch of other funky stuff. I do add mycorrhizal fungi. I'm not super picky about my source as long as it's a good trusted source. Other beneficial microbes, and then depending on the soil, that's kind of my base blend. And then we make a really hot living soil, hot meaning like full of a lot of nutrients, where we'll add blood meal, different minerals, azomite, and different earth minerals, bone meal, and we'll cook that soil. And it gets really, really hot. It can get up to 150 degrees if you stick a thermometer in there. And then as it cools, we'll add compost. Definitely compost is a big part of the mix as well. And then from there, that living soil is going to be way too hot for lavender. So for lavender, we mainly use, again, the ratio is 3 scoops of the not hot stuff with just your compost, your peat, pumice, and then we'll add 1 scoop of that hot soil, which will kind of inoculate that and give it some nutrients it needs. Whereas other plants like mints and a lot of the annuals is really more of that hot stuff that's just full of nutrients that wants to grow. So it changes a lot, throughout the season and for what we're potting. But I'd be happy to share some of my recipes if somebody wants to email me.
Okay. I can't remember if maybe you want to drop it in the chat, or
oh yeah,
I can't remember if it was on your presentation. Let's see here. What size trays do you use for your cutting?
So most of my cuttings, I use a 15 by 19 flat. Oh, there you go. So this is what a little goofy, okay. But that's what I root my cuttings in. It's basic flat. You can see it's got tons of drainage holes. These are the same flats that we put our plants in, but I also root cuttings in there. I'll fill that with my medium and then fill that up. And depending on the plant, I'll fit anywhere from 100 to 200 cuttings in there. As I said, I space them pretty tight because we're low on space around here, and they grow all into each other. But yeah, that's what I use. I will use cell trays on occasion, but again, you don't fit quite as many in there. So if you're not going for volume, cell trays are great. If you need a lot of volume, then those flats are really great. 15 by 19 inches.
Okay. All right, and then some thank yous here. Thank you. Excellent presentation. He's the best of the best. Great presentation. Learned a lot. Thank you for doing this. Very informative. Such a well done presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Jered. This was great. Very informative. Great presentation. And then a question.
Awesome.
So like I said, really, really great. Is there any role for bottom watering with seeds or cuttings?
It very controlled, but I'm not a fan, again, just because of the standing water. You want to, it's just inviting pathogens. So if you've got good clean water and a sterile tray that you're soaking it in, but it's just a little more maintenance. If you are doing the bottom watering, you can absolutely do that, and I've done it in the past, but you want to make sure that you're removing the tray as soon as that soil is up to field capacity or a little less. You do not want it to sit in that water for very long. So absolutely, bottom watering can work, but you got to monitor it just as well and be prepared to remove it promptly.
Okay. And then most excellent presentation. Thanks, Jered. Well done. And then another question. Have you ever used parboiled rice hulls instead of perlite?
Not for propagation. I've done rice holes and different soil mixes on occasion, but no, I have not tried it for propagation. But I don't see why it wouldn't work. Again, it's really about keeping it happy. So as long as you could keep those rice holes at the correct moisture, honestly, you could probably root a cutting in shredded paper. It's really all about that moisture, making sure that the cutting has moisture, both top and bottom, and that it's the correct moisture, not too wet, not too dry. So I say experiment and let us know how it goes for sure. Give it a try.
Okay. Let's see. And then have you ever used biochar in your soil mix?
Oh yeah, we use a lot of biochar, mainly outside. Again, the greenhouse environment is totally different than the outside environment. Outside, we're just piling on as much organic as we can, and biochar is a big part of that. We've even made a little bit of our own. We'll buy it. We have a great place down the street that has it available. I do not usually put biochar in my potting mixes. I have put biochar in the hot mixes, which then gets cut if I'm putting lavender in it, but I haven't in the last few years. I've just skipped it. Biochar is fantastic, definitely has its purpose, but not something I use in the greenhouse.
Okay. Okay. And thank you. Awesome job, Jered. Thank you. So informative. What an awesome presentation. This was fantastic. Can you please share the info for the upcoming seed gathering webinar? I'll include that when I email the um, registrants here. What is the name of Jered's farm?
Goodwin Creek Gardens here in Williams, Oregon. It's been around since the 70s, started by Jim and Dottie Becker, and we took it over back in 2018. Pretty much kept doing what they're doing, plus a lot more. We've added a lot of varieties of lavender. We've been field growing a lot more, making tea blends, tinctures, essential oils. So we've kind of put our own spin on it, but still propagating plants. Lavender is our specialty. So Goodwin Creek Gardens, look us up.
Nice. Okay. And I'll try to get your information and share it again with folks when I email tomorrow. Let's see. How do you verify a grower's mother plant for cutting is true to species?
That's tough. You want to start with a good source from the beginning. I will not take cuttings off of plants that I am not familiar with for exactly that reason. And most of the time, I won't take cuttings anywhere from but our nursery, which is these plants right here. If you've bought plants from us, they could have come off of these plants. They're our little mother stock plot. So I just won't. I built up the collection. It took a long time to build the collection. I had some great help. If you're not familiar with Andy and Melissa Van Hefflingen, I probably butchered their name, but they're incredible lavender folks who spend a lot of time collecting plants from the source. So we were fortunate enough to get a lot of plants from them. But I'm hesitant. I will not buy a variety from Home Depot or from a nursery and assume it's correct. So it's taken a long time to build the collection, a lot of observation. And so I'm hesitant, and it's tough to say whether they've got a true variety or not.
That's really interesting. I popped the email into the chat if you can get that. Otherwise, it will come in the email tomorrow. Someone says, can we visit your nursery?
Absolutely. So we're open seasonally. It's a fairly small operation, and for the last 6 years, it's been all just me and my wife doing all of it. We actually just hired somebody, which is really cool because we're trying to get more lavender out there. So we are only open seasonally. We typically open in late April or early May. Again, it depends on the weather. We're very dependent on the weather for when our plants will be ready. We don't rush them. And so we usually post it on our website, but it's usually late April or early May that we open, and we've got tons of plants out available. We've got our gardens open, and then we typically close for the summer, mid-July once it starts getting hot, but then we open back up for a month in fall. So the hours vary. Now I am always open by appointment as well. So if it's in the off season and you're in town, definitely email. Again, because it's been me, sometimes the responses on the emails could be a bit delayed, but we're trying to pick that up and get better. So be happy to set up an appointment and give you a tour or come out during open hours and check out what we got going on.
Great. Terrific. And then let's see, for willow, one final question here. For willow water, what is the best pH?
You know, I've this is probably bad. I've never honestly checked the pH of the willow water. It's just something, again, I don't use it all the time. The most I'll ever use it is twice in a season, and it's just to water in. So I kind of just I trust it. Now you can have too many of those auxin hormones in there, and so that's why I always dilute. And most of the recipes you'll see will not say to dilute. So that's something that I just do as a little bit of a cautionary thing, is to dilute to make sure there's not enough. But you could probably use it undiluted just fine. But as far as the pH, I apologize, I do not know. But now I'm going to measure it. So next time I make a batch, I'm going to check the pH and I'll have an answer for you.
You know, with houseplants, a lot of them you'll just put them in the water and they'll root, but some won't as much. And I just stick a willow stem in there with them if they're reluctant to start
Oh, wow.
rooting. So,
Nice.
and yeah,
Very cool.
and then
Yeah, and
they'll root
willow, you
together.
can
And I
take a
think the roots are also of the willow are also releasing the auxins. So,
I'm sure, yeah,
yeah,
because willow, you can take a big chunk of willow branch and just stick it right in the ground
yeah,
outside, and it's going to root and grow. So it's an amazing plant. We love it.
yeah. Okay, wonderful. Terrific, Jered. You're really a plant whisperer. That was just a delight.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank you. I had a
everybody
lot of
else,
fun.
yeah, terrific. Wonderful. So I'll communicate with y'all tomorrow, probably. Okay, take care.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Oh wait, I'm gonna launch the poll. And if you're still around, let's see, did I do that? Launch, here we go. If you're still around, it's just a quick three quick questions while we're closing up here. And Jered, you're welcome to go. I'll send you the results too. I'm
Awesome.
sure it'll be great. People, this was wonderful. Really good.
Very cool. Thanks again for
Excellent.
hosting
Yep.
OSU Land Stewards program, and thank you everybody for logging on and letting me chat about plants.
It was a joy. Yeah, thank you.
Bye.